who we've got this evening. Hello, Callan. How are you doing?
Hi, good to see you. Good to see you. Good to be here.
Fantastic. And Javier, how are you doing?
I'm all right. Thank you, William. How are you?
Yes, very well. Well, I think the first thing to do, why don't I just ask you both to do a quick introduction to yourself? Callan, do you want to go first?
Yep, I'm Callan Gallagher. I work I teach at St Andrews University in sort of economics and history, but I've for many years also been a union organizer in one capacity or another. In the last few years, increasingly in the gig economy as well, with an organization called the Workers Observatory, which we got going a few years ago too. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm also a historian of economics, so it's always informing my thinking too. So yeah.
Fantastic. And Javier?
Yeah, my name is Xavier Villares, or Xavier for locals. And my background, I study economics, and then I specialize in specialization is in economic development and innovation, and also in festival and events management, because you need to diversify. And I've been living in Scotland for 8 years now, and I've been working with the observatory since we founded this back in 2019. And during my time here, I've been a community organizer, a community manager for quite a few years, and I've been working, with the observatory. I'm currently the secretary of the observatory, and I've been doing some project management around there. And that's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. And you're also a previous guest at the Scotonomics Festival in Dundee, which is where we met you. So it's nice to see you again. Well, I suppose thanks for the introduction. It sounds like you're both in a really good position to be able to support this initiative that we're going to cover in detail tonight, the Workers Observatory. So could you tell us a bit more about where the idea came from and also what the organisation's aims are? I don't know which one of you wants to start with that, if you just want to tell me, and then we can move on there.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about where it kind of came from, and then I'll hand over to Xavi about some of the current aims. So the Workers Observatory sprung up as it became clear that an expanding fraction of the workforce in Scotland was in the gig economy and the platform economy. And it was about 10 years ago when platforms started to appear on the scene. And it became clear that the conventional or established trade unions weren't working in that area for a whole range of reasons we might go into. But there seemed to be a challenge basically around not just how to support workers to organize in this space, but even prior to that, how to gather the insights and the information and the knowledge that would enable that kind of process and initiative to move forward. So that's where the name comes from as well. This notion of observing and understanding as being absolutely fundamental to that bigger project of trying to build power in the gig economy was captured in that notion of the observatory, which was inspired a little bit, as our logo is, by the old observatory here in Edinburgh. So it's very much an Edinburgh-rooted project as well, playing a little bit with the idea, an old tradition on, I guess, trade union organising called Workers Inquiry, very much about equipping ourselves through inquiry to build power. And shifting that into a workplace where it's not one particular place, but it's right across the city. So I suppose that's some of the genesis of the Workers Observatory as an idea. And it was initially in my capacity as a union organizer that things got going a few years ago. Various things have happened then. But Xavi, do you want to say something a bit about what we're up to in terms of our current aims?
Well, so right now, last year was really crazy year. We've been very busy. We developed an organization, an association of riders in the city. I think this was a really important line of work called Room, and we've been able to create a stable bridge to talk to different institutions about the issues around gig economy and around fair work and so on. How sometimes gig economy falls out of what it's supposed that matters in terms of fair work because of the way that the gig economy is structured and the lack of responsibility sometimes that the companies got toward their workers. So we've been establishing these bridges with different institutions, especially with the Edinburgh Council, and it's been great. We've been doing work in Edinburgh, but also in Dundee. And right now we are also in the middle of something we are really passionate about it, the Migrant Justice Edinburgh with Regenerative Future Funding, and we are working with another 2 organizations on this. Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a ride the last year, and especially the last year.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, we're definitely going to delve into some of the work you've been doing over that period. But you know, in the introduction, and as you've highlighted, much of the focus of the Workers Observatory is on the gig economy. So I'd just quite like to dig into that, I think, to get going. But could you, one of you, start by giving us a definition of the gig economy, and then could you give us some kind of like key facts about that kind of new style of work? I'd like to think about, you know, how long has this been a big part of the economy? What type of jobs are now gig jobs that maybe weren't in the past, and kind of a general feel to give people about the gig economy?
Well, I can say a little bit about this, Callan, if you want to complete too. Well, in terms of what the gig economy is, I mean, when we're talking about, sometimes we talk about gig economy, we sometimes talk about platform economy, which got some kind of overlap on that, but although it's not exactly the same. But we're talking about the kind of economy where workers are working instead of for a specific period of time. We're talking about the specific gigs, specific tasks that are performed and are paid by these specific pieces. So so about this is a really a big myriad of different kind of works that are these. I mean, we've been very focused on delivery workers and our work, also care work, but this is going. This is a broad range from people working online, doing all kind of specific tasks, to delivery workers and care workers, as I was saying. What types of jobs? As I say, it's a broad range. Callum, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, sure. There's one way. I mean, there's various ways to think about it. The classic ones that come to mind are ride hailing and food delivery, because they're the visible ones. So these are platform-based work, where if you're working on it, you've not got a 9-to-5 contract. You've not even got a 0 hours contract. You have a platform or an app that you log on to, and that's where you access the certain jobs that come up, and they'll offer you a rate, and you'll decide whether you take it or not. And that's the kind of classic case. But there's also a lot of online work as well, which is much less visible. But if you're doing work for the likes of TaskRabbit, there's websites, or Amazon Turk, the websites that will give you little bits of micro work, it's sometimes called. And you take them on and you do them in the time it takes with your skills you have. And you're paid again by the task rather than by the hour. And so that there's also care work. There's also all kinds of different sorts of gig work. Now, gig work itself is not a new thing. There's been gig work as long as there's been work, and there's great histories and stories of 18th century food delivery workers and all the rest of it. I think what's important, and Xabi did allude to this, is the platformization of gig. And the platformization of gig work involves the introduction of these new technological systems that companies can use to coordinate and extract this kind of work from workers on a mass scale. Sometimes they're called mediators between the worker and the customer and the service provider. So the platform sits and connects the restaurant, in this case, with the food delivery worker and the customer, and that platformization is part of the gig economy, but it's not the whole gig economy, as it were. Another way to think of this is therefore kind of technologically and historically, what are the kinds of new work that is sprung up in more recent years, and what are the kinds of work that have been around for so long that they're becoming quite embedded in the economy? Well, the latter kinds of work will tend to be more regulated. They might have more of an ordinary wage system. New forms of work, there's still a question about how they're taking form and the ways in which they're they're kind of structuring themselves in the economy. So it's a hard one to define in a nutshell, is basically the answer. But we definitely see the likes of food delivery as unambiguously frontiers in this kind of gig platform work. And that's why it's so important. We'll get into why, but I suppose that's a bit of an overview.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful. Kieran, do you want to jump in now with anything?
Yeah, so I have worked in this sector. I worked for a well-known gym chain, and that was an example of a hybrid where you're both employed and kind of not employed at the same time. And there's really there's no security really in any way. I've also worked in the restaurant trade as well for many years. And my question to you would be, thinking about these places, do you think the unions are in the right places? Because my impression is that they're actually not, and they're actually quite often in places where the work that they are involved in seeing the workers' rights about are actually quite safe jobs, like the civil service.
I can go first on that one. I suppose there's unions, and unions would be my first thought. What is a union if it isn't workers coming together, discussing their conditions and deciding to do something about it? And if that's what a union is, then a union is wherever workers are doing that. And workers are doing that in the gig economy. And that's not to swerve the fact that the established formal unions that are part of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, your Unisons, your Unites, your GMBs, and also, I guess, the myriad of other unions, I suppose it connects to what I was saying about the history, have emerged and developed and embedded themselves and built up strength in sectors which were much bigger in the past. And they're always having to make judgments. Do we stay in these sectors or do we go into new sectors? And hitherto in Scotland, at any rate, there hasn't been much initiative from unions to make that shift. Part of that is to do with the law, in that if you're a gig worker, according to the British government, you are self-employed, technically, and therefore you don't have access to a whole range of rights, including those rights relating to formal union structures. And those are the rights that the established unions know really well how to navigate and exercise. So it's another reason why you haven't seen so much moving into this sector. I suppose that's where the definition of union becomes important. But around the world, if you're stepping out of Scotland, there are great examples of mass unionization in these sectors. So it's not to say that isn't coming. But I suppose the point is it's still early days.
Okay. Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is how does it compare with other countries? Have you looked into that? How are they coping with this type of work in Spain, in the Netherlands, Germany, places like that? Have you looked into that?
Yeah. If I may say something here, so I think that in general feeling there are. Sorry, no. Say, Callum. Go for it.
No, you go ahead, Javi. You go ahead.
Oh, well, okay. Well, quickly. So that depends also on the different places. Got different. Callum, I would like that also later to comment a little bit on your own experience abroad with this. But I think that also depending on the country, on the place, you will have different experiences. But I think that in general, unions, in the way that we know them, they don't feel comfortable on this area. They don't feel like they can establish an organization in the way that you usually do. I think that the precarity of this work and the massive turnover that you find there, that is not only happening, in gig economy. You can find it also in places where actually unionization, maybe unions are not that present, retail and so on, but the gig economy is particularly strong because also, well, the nature of many of the workers, that they are not, maybe they're not born here, or they don't have like a huge barriers in terms of language, and I don't feel like many times like these unions here or other places find that they can feel safe doing these things. Then there is also the idea of, no, they are self-employees, they are not workers in a real sense. So we are not feeling neither comfortable with that, which is something that I think that unions in general should think about it more profoundly, because the size of the gig economy itself, the gig work, is just growing and growing, and they went from the fringe of the economy to the very center, at the very core right now. And it's something that they need to think, if they want to keep relevant for the big debates, they need to be where the workers are. And the workers right now are going there, not because they choose to in many cases, but because it's the way that things are going right now. So I think that is a general panorama after, having conversation with people in other countries in Europe, that sometimes this feeling of isolation respect to the broader movement of unions. But as Callan say, unions are where workers are organizing themselves and demanding. So yeah. This is just the very beginning. This has been around for just a few years, and real problems are starting right now. So you cannot ask, like for things being solved like that quick. But
I've got a question from our audience, if that's okay. Any questions I'll put straight up onto the screen, as long as they don't completely ruin our flow. But this is a really good question related to unions. So Callan, maybe you want to answer this one. How could trade unions, as supposing, as you said, that they want to, how do they attract gig workers, or how do they get into the spaces where gig workers are?
So again, I would probably come back to where I was before. What do you mean by trade unions? In the sense, if we're talking about the established trade unions, how could they get to where gig workers are? There's a range of things. One is that quite often the people who are doing gig work are from migrant communities and aren't necessarily involved in the kinds of communities and cultures that unions are already operating in. So I think there's always a work to be done as to figuring out how to involve and support people who aren't necessarily as familiar with the lay of the land in Scotland as unions might be. I think that there's also a question around the methods that unions are using and the intentions that they are going into organizing with. What I mean by that is, if you're an established union, you've got quite a tried and tested model of going into a workplace, recruiting, that being sustainable in terms of membership fees, identifying issues in the workplace that you'll then start to try and figure out solutions to. But really, you've got a strategy in an ordinary workplace to try and get formal recognition agreements, which then puts the union in a place of being a representative voice through, again, tried and tested processes to try and agree on some certain outcomes. And that's all within that framework of the kind of 20th century paradigm of the way that workplaces are governed that just doesn't work, doesn't apply, isn't happening in the gig economy. So if you're thinking about how to move into that space, unions will have to recalibrate their purpose and their power base and their intentions away from those more technical processes towards thinking about what it is to build power in the gig economy and how it is that you can involve people and bring people to invest themselves in collective formations that don't necessarily follow those kind of paths. I think that's a
completely new world, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very different environment. It's a very different set of technologies, and it's a very different set of methods. And it's one that so often goes invisible as well. It goes invisible partly because it's under the surface of what the government's concerned with. It's partly to do with the fact that quite often it is migrants or lower paid workers. And actually, it's partly because unions aren't speaking necessarily when they're talking to government about the experiences of those workers. So yeah, it's a challenging one.
I'm going to move the conversation on because we've got lots to cover. I don't want to spend too much time on unions, but let's get into the details of it. And these gig workers, they don't, being devil's advocate here, they don't need unions. These are brilliant jobs in the gig economy. It allows workers to completely take control by supplying what they want rather than it being demanded by a boss. It offers flexibility, and for many people, it provides a great side hustle. So, what are we complaining about, you two? Isn't this great? Do you want to take those arguments on?
Sure. May I say something there, maybe? So this is a very interesting approach, because you can have people that got like a really different views on the same thing. No, I remember being at the well, a certain committee on the Scottish Parliament not long ago, and someone there say, well, when some people are seeing exploitation, other people see opportunity. And I was like, okay, that's a way to put it, an angle. But problem is that there are a lot of promises on that. Be your own boss, administrate your own time. Like this idea of finance freedom, and also having a sense of control of your life. But at the end of the day, when you got data, and one of the big issues is also that we don't have that much data about what's happening in this sector, you see that people are doing several jobs, and they remain precarious even below the line of poverty. These platforms also got a strategy. It's been around for more than 1 decade, and they started putting a completely different way to pay their workers. I'm talking right now about delivery, because it's what we know very well. And they started with very competitive, not salaries, but the way that the wages that you were making at the end. Actually, at the beginning, they were paying per hour, instead of only per gig, which was a completely different way to understand work also. And then once they destroy the fabric and the city, they are not anymore like other companies that can do this. And after being supported by years and years by private equity and a lot of money from investors, then they start to drop that what they are paying to riders, when it's completely full of riders all over the place, and they are still somehow enjoying this good image that it's not real. It's not what really is happening behind the curtains. I mean, not for everybody. As I say, if you go out with your bike a few hours a week to get some extra money and so on, that's great. But that's not what's happening. Our data reveals that most of our riders depend on the money that they are doing with the bikes, and that's not. And we're talking about people that are being paid as minimum thing is £2.90 per order, in some cases. So we're talking about £10 an hour sometimes, and some people that are on the streets the whole day, and they can do sometimes £30, £40 the whole day after being out until super late. So the reality and what they talk about, they don't match very well, especially after the pandemic, that you see a dramatic drop on the fees that they are actually paying. So that will be my answer into this. People are being like brought to this part of the economy with promises, and then the reality is not exactly what you're expecting.
Brilliant. And Callan, anything to add?
I think that it's just important to underline that figure that Xabi said, that way more than half of the people in the gig economy aren't doing it as a side anything. This is your job. This is what you're getting your income from. This is where, if you go out in the morning, then what you can get that day, that's what you'll have, to live on. And that's why people aren't so much working by the hours anymore, but you'll go out with the target figure. And that could mean that you have to be out for many, many hours, 16, 17, 18 hours. If you're out for 16, 17, 18 hours, and that's becoming embedded in the economy as a cohort of the labor force, people are exhausted. The street is your workplace. It's a lonely job. Like, these conditions can't be kind of put to one side and said, well, you're opting into it. It's that would, it's a part of the labor market. In which people are finding they have to work in order to earn a living. And I think that, leaving aside the question whether anybody really wants to and choose to do this kind of work or any kind of work, I think it's quite clear that the conditions in this sector should be making us seriously think about what sort of economy is emerging in which this kind of work can become standardized.
I think that is such an important point about the condition of work, because we often think about the individual tasks and maybe not being something that you would want to do for a job, but it's the conditions which these are done in. Certainly with delivery, the inherent danger of being on the road, being in a hurry, knowing that you get paid more the quicker you could do it. You know, I saw something today about courier riders in London, and they were expected to have a serious accident every 18 months. You know, and that was just built into the system. But the thing about courier riders, if you've ever met a courier rider, they're absolutely mental. They're like adrenaline junkies who've got those types of jobs kind of partly for the danger. But that doesn't cross over at all to the type of people who are doing the delivery jobs in our cities. So thanks for that answer. I've got another one for you, another question in terms of another big thing that comes from this kind of neoliberal, neoclassical understanding, this point of view around individuals. And this type of work, this unleashes the untrapped entrepreneur that's in every single one of us. You know, we all want this potential to go out and work as hard as we can and be our own boss. This is kind of starting to get into a little bit of the evidence that you've collected. But I suppose in general, what do you feel about this inherent nature that's in us to want these types of jobs and to live this type of life, the life of an entrepreneur?
You go ahead, Javi.
Quickly, yeah. Well, I'm unmuted now. Good. Well, a little bit, following what we were talking about before, I think that, the gig work in that sense encapsulates very well, the general feeling in terms of the self-exploitation without limits. This world that we are living right now, where you need to love your job and you need to live only for producing, and there's no space there's no private sphere to enjoy your own, but everything needs to be monetized. In that sense, like, make your hobby a source of income too. Like, if you like cycling, go to work. I think it taps really well in that mindset. It's also that, the way that neoliberal governments and establishment has been outsourcing collective responsibility in many areas, including work, towards the market, towards the private sphere. They create your own job because it's your own responsibility, when at the end of the day, we are very dependent on a specific economic structure. We belong to a specific backgrounds, and opportunities right now are very scarce. They want to, at the same time that you got the ultra wealthy, getting all the assets, all the resources, they want everybody to create their own job and don't bother others with your problems, basically. So I think that the gig economy look for tap on all of that, and in that sense, I think they're giving very few solutions, and if they are doing something, is basically making the making work way more precarious, because you suppose that you have this fantasy of being an independent contractor. Again, talking about riders, for example, but at the end of the day, you depend completely on what the company is giving you through the platform, because they fake to be, in the middle of, like, middleman. We are just moving things around, but at the end of the day, they got the data about the product. They move they know the restaurants, they know the customers, and they are there in the middle. And then there's this fiction that you are an independent contractor, that you can do whatever you want. But at the end of the day, if they deactivate your account, you can talk to them whatever you want, that they can no answer at all, and then you are out of business, basically, because there are 4 or 5 companies.
Because it is the they have the control, and they have the tools of production platforms, don't they? The idea that you are this person who's able to manage yourself. I remember some wonderful research that was done by it was in the book Poor Economics, and they have a huge data set against some of the poorest countries in the world. And the whole plan for right through then, Javier, with development economics, was that you need to kind of microfinance, and you had to turn all these poorest people in the world into budding entrepreneurs, because that was within them all. Someone just wanted to have this type of career. And after about 15, 20 years, they had the research, and it went out to everyone and said, what's the job that you want? If you could choose, what job would you have? And about 90% of them said a steady government job. And that was, that is what people want. They want the security, and they want a decent job. The vast majority, and the idea that we are all these kind of hidden entrepreneurs is something that's severely lacking in evidence. And Callie, when I saw you last weekend speaking in Edinburgh, you mentioned how the gig economy, a lot of people think of them as precarious workers, and you explained where that word, the kind of history of that word comes from. And I thought it was a fascinating kind of introduction into the type of jobs that people do. So the gig economy is precarious. What did you think? What did you think it means when people say that?
Yeah, it's an interesting word. I mean, I think I used to do a lot of work training with precarious workers, and I would say, what do you think precarious means? And the metaphor that comes to mind is something unstable, something that will collapse, something that is a little bit prone to toppling. And I think that's true in a kind of material situation. What that doesn't capture is the relationship that you're in a precarious job. That describes, if you like, the kind of the risk of falling, but it doesn't describe why you're there. Precariousness is a relationship, as Xabi has just described it, with the fact that somebody can pull all that away at any moment. And effectively, you're at the mercy of someone. So the word precarious, actually, the root of the word precarious is precar, to pray. So the notion is originally in that term that you don't have something to depend on. You have to pray for it. You have to pray that people will give you it. You have to perhaps even entreat someone to keep giving you what you don't necessarily have independently. So I suppose that describes and illustrates, if you think of precarity in that way, that relationship, which is so often obscured in this individualized, neoclassical, every person to themselves notion, fiction, if you like, of what an independent job it might be. And I think a lot of the technologies, I know a lot of the technologies are designed to obscure the relationship and to emphasize the independence, even to the extent that a platform will be using AI to generate low fees, but it also uses AI to test and generate the language and pictures it gives to the workers as they're engaging. So it will try and optimize what messages can I use to give someone that notional entrepreneurial drive that otherwise, wouldn't sustain the system. So there is a psychological game going on here around precarity, and they know it fine.
Yeah, that is. I definitely want to get into that because it is fascinating when you look at the role of technology in AI. But I did want to touch on some of the research that you've done so far. I mean, when you're speaking to people in the gig economy, what are they saying to you? What is the kind of lived experience that you've been capturing in the research that you've been doing?
Shall I go briefly, Xabi, with that, and then you can come in? I suppose just a word, because it's relevant about, I suppose, the methods around the Workers Observatory. The Workers Observatory is not a set of researchers speaking to workers about conditions. The Workers Observatory is a set of tools and resources to enable workers to investigate their own conditions. And so the questions that arise are questions that are framed by workers who are interested and curious about their conditions. And that's why I suppose the project's so exciting, is because the people who know most about the work are obviously the people that do it every day. And so the way that they navigate and share knowledge and surface tacit knowledge and validate the knowledge they already have is what builds this knowledge into power. And it also, in a very kind of procedural way, frames the questions that they ask. So they designed a group of about 25 workers designed to survey themselves, and some of the outputs of that survey that they spread around Edinburgh. And it will give you a good sense of what they're interested in. So 4 out of 5 riders work in food delivery as their main or only job. 4 out of 5. So wow. There's not a freedom that people imagine. 1 out of 3 riders had an accident while doing food delivery work in the last 6 months. You said the likelihood of 1 every 18 months. So that's actually exactly the same statistic we're finding as you're saying about London. 40% have had their bike or vehicle stolen while doing delivery work. Think of the cost implications of that. 85% of riders experience chronic physical pain due to their work. 85, again, in a conventional workplace, that would be more than a travesty. The workplace would shut down. And yet this is becoming the norm. And 70% of riders believe they don't receive the tips given to them via the app. So people think that they're tipping workers when they're putting a tip on Deliveroo. Most workers, well, it's not coming through. It's just a little snapshot, and there's plenty more research, but hopefully that gives a flavor of the kind of things that workers want others to know about their day-to-day experiences.
Yeah, which is so important. Javi, do you anything to add to that, to give us the stories from the streets?
Factors there, and think that that shows the how that is going right now, and yeah, in terms of fees, the things I already said before, but the last 2 years the things went really worse, and the last few months, for example, I mean, we have the stories of seriously things that nobody should be exposed to in terms of payment. Now we're talking about people are working. So Deliveroo used to stop the service at around midnight. Midnight to 1, things got like really slow, and then until 7 the next day, that was it. But now you see riders at 3, at 4 in the morning. They're still working there, because our people are not going out for a number of hours. They're going out to hit a target. So I need 50 pounds today. I'm not gonna go home until I got 50 pounds. So it's gonna be 12, 1, 2, and then because of the way that the whole thing is developing through code research, we've been going through this. You have a boost at certain time that they know that there's no orders, but they need people there so they can do those orders. They can keep at the minimum what they are paying, because one of the key things here that we understood very well from the beginning, but with the workers is clear. They need the waiting time. Without the waiting time, without that time that workers are just waiting for the order, you can see them on the streets. They are there waiting for orders in the afternoon, especially after the peak of the midday, and then in the evening again. They're just waiting for one order or something to do something with that. They need that time, that availability. It's all about workers' time. So for me, if there is a key takeaway on this, is time that the platform needs extract from people, from workers, to actually make things work and make huge profit. For the first time, they are doing like really huge profit because they've been playing on this strategy. And for me, this is one of the key takeaways. You want to talk about the research on this?
Fantastic. Well, we're just going to take a little 20-second commercial break, and then we'll be back. If you're enjoying this episode of the Scotonomics podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/Scotonomics. Also, please do like, share, and comment on this podcast. That's new for this year. Well, before we move on to platforms, I've also seen some research that says that many people are pushed into uncertain and informal services. They will rely on debt and like debt to survive, and they become easy prey for scammers and predatory finance. And I just wonder if there was anything, before we move on to the platform, was there any evidence that was happening in Scotland, taking on big debts to get into this and then being really close to being able to, for other people to kind of pick up on your need to pay that finance, and predatory lending, payday loans and things like that?
Well, I can say briefly on this. So what you say, that I think that's one of the also key issues. That is debt. Like riders, sometimes they don't have their own bike, so they need to rent the bike, and that's already like £200 a month, for example, on average here in Edinburgh, for example. So the debt they have this relationship with debt that is always there. Then your bike goes stolen, and then you are again in huge trouble. So they rely a lot on the network that they got close, on their friends, and they help each other a lot, and that's great. But sometimes, yeah, the circumstances got really nasty. What I can say about the scams that I see, and we see a lot, it's scams in terms of the deactivation. Like people got deactivated from there, and they offer a service that if you pay a fee, they will get that restored magically somehow. We don't know how yet, but you call a number, then they ask you for money, and then you put the money, and then buy, basically. we know about this in particular, and it's sad.
Yeah, because people are so desperate for the work, they really are. They really are there to be preyed upon. Callan, I want to ask you about the kind of platform element now. We touched on it, but I really think, as you said, it's if it's not the gig economy, it's a huge part of it. I was doing some reading today, and I came across the phrase digitally turbocharged Taylorism. And I wonder if that one did it for you. But I suppose a kind of a direct question, can you explain the role of the platform in all of this? And again, playing devil's advocate, surely they're just this neutral bit of useful technology that puts buying sellers together.
Yeah, I think there's different ways of thinking about what the platforms are engineering. Because in many ways, that's what they're doing. They're creating great big engineering systems for distributing and extracting, distributing work and extracting profits from that. But also, crucially, they are machines for extracting data, and they wouldn't work without that function. So leaving aside the way they control workers for a moment, if you think about what Deliveroo is, apart from all those contracts, it is a great big vacuum of data about how cities work, how you can move around them, how you can distribute goods in them, about what supply and demand is, about what workers are willing to work for, about how long they're willing to work, about the minimum they'll work. And also, likewise, what customers are willing to pay. It becomes a great big database that you can then use to maximize your system. And as a profit-driven platform, that's what it's going to do. Now, what it won't necessarily do is always optimize maximum profit right in the here and now, because it's in the business of trying to embed itself right in across the city to obtain a monopoly that allows it to do that in the long term. That's what it's in the business of. It wants rid of the others. And therefore, if you can plunge huge amounts of investment in there to get as much data as possible, and maybe even subsidize pay for a little while, then you'll get a grip on the kind of city or the whole infrastructure that will allow you to be in control there. And I suppose we sometimes talk about platformization as being that process. So I think that is one of the things that needs to be borne in mind, because it's always it's a little bit in tension with that question of Taylorism. Taylorism, I guess I think of as, how do you create a system that can absolutely maximize right in the here and now the extraction and parceling up of the little tasks to make the as much as possible for as little as possible? Ultimately, sure, that's what it's doing, but it's also gathering a huge amount of data. So I guess if we think of Taylor as a great expert of observing and monitoring, and applying and testing and putting down new lessons on the basis of that evidence, then I think it probably does become quite a good model. But it's always worth bearing in mind that it isn't just simply minimizing the amount of pay that's given at any time. It's also testing all the time as well. And it's testing a model that is transferable, that could work in different sectors potentially. And that's why I think it's such a concern, I suppose, about the way in which these frontiers of the gig economy, which are seen as great honeypots by investors, need to be tempered to prevent that kind of imposition of a new sort of Taylorist paradigm.
Fantastic. That's a brilliant answer. Javi, do you have anything to add on that?
I think that basically, that this technology has been designed with a very specific purpose, and it's a technology that tends to isolate workers and try to prevent them from work collaboratively. Like the other ones are competing for the same chunk with you, and this also helps you generate sometimes the difficult situations because among workers, if ones are working more than others, and then you know what I mean. So that's design. That's all is in design. The only thing that they care about is how people interact with the app. So there's nothing that is a consequence that is not measured. You know what I mean? So that's something that we need to always bear in mind with these things.
I would just add one more thing to that as well, which is that there's no uniformity across the world of how many people are involved in the management process in a platform system. There are some places where the platform works without interruption with hardly any human managers. And there are other places where there are quite a lot of team leaders required to keep order. So I spent a month in India in different cities working with food delivery workers, and there you have a lot of team leaders making the system run. And I think that points to something that I guess I'm always thinking about too, is what is the human dimension amongst workers that pushes against that kind of fragmentation. And I suppose that's always part of the considerations of a manager, and it's obviously always part of a consideration of an organizer too.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen, have you got a question?
Yeah, I mean that I would imagine that, you know, I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, obviously, a lot of things that we do provide data for the companies that are involved. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of delivery. It's not a service that I use at all, really. I think a lot of people would be alarmed if they understood that. I think they would be alarmed if they understood that the tips that they think they're giving are not going to the rider. I wonder if there's really space for a provider that is an alternative to this, like DuckDuckGo is to Google, or the Co-op is to other supermarkets, where they take a more, we will do this business, but we will make it much more sound, essentially.
Yeah, I'll go and then you go, Xavi. I mean, Xavi and I, we talk about this, and a lot of people do, because there's different views, I guess, about it's great, it sounds great. There's different views about feasibility, and it depends if you're an optimist or a pessimist in many ways. I mean, one of the things we know for sure is that what the platform companies will fight tooth and nail to prevent another app getting a foothold. And they might do that just by coming in and undercutting and suddenly giving loads of freebies to people. So you're relying then on the goodwill of the customer, rather than the kind of raw economic decision-making forces that I guess a lot of companies rely on. So you're incorporating an ethics into the system, which I suppose it's questionable whether that can become a basis for the economy. But on the other hand, you know, the sustainable fashion and all these kind of things we can point to as being evidence that people want to make such choices. So the jury's out, I think, as to whether that is going to become a kind of global route. Xavi, do you have any specific thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that the observatory, one of the characteristics that we have, you know, apart from sometimes being something similar to what a trade union could do, you know, it's about also, you know, we really believe in broader alliances, and we got a very interesting meeting that an event at the end of last year that we will reproduce very soon. We'll keep you updated about other spaces that are very interested in what's happening there, because there are, again, several things that overlap there, and we want to collaborate and we want to be part of that too. So in terms of flex work, fair work, anti-poverty, third sector organizations, researchers, AI policymakers, we've been in touch with a lot of organizations to raise awareness on this, because in our view, you know, I think that the image, the public image of these companies is not what really it's happening actually, as we mentioned before. In terms of that, I think that there are certain alternatives. For example, in Edinburgh used to be other kind of organization, also small businesses that were trying to do the same work and cover this space, but it's quite difficult because, as Callum was mentioning, the apps, these big platforms are always keeping an eye on these things. Personally, I believe that cooperatives can be an option, and that public PAC cooperatives should be something that we should be considering more carefully, because I think that in the future can be something that can actually change the panorama in terms of this kind of new technologies that are emerging. Yeah. But this could be for a different episode, maybe.
Yeah, I'm sure there is something in this, but you know, the couple of points I would make is that these jobs and the kind of proclivity of this work arises because the system is designed to generate these types of work and generate this type of employment. So it's really system change that we're looking at. The idea that you can just compete by being slightly nicer in these areas that shouldn't exist, I think, is a big challenge for us. And I would say from a MMT perspective, we think we've got a solution which will help and would help support all of those in this industry, which is a job guarantee, which is hopefully we'll have time, as we're running a little bit short, to cover that. But I do think there's other policies rather than going in and competing in this market, but there's other ways of changing the structure so we support people in these jobs, or even better, I suppose, support them in ways that they don't have to take these jobs. Now, I just wanted to kind of finish on this point of platforms. The platforms I would consider them to be purely predatory, and they've not discovered or innovated new ways to deliver services. They've simply cut the wages of those who were originally doing the service or have started delivering it, but with terrible wages. And I found some research today. Research indicates that 85% of the cost of operating a taxi is fixed, and there are no economies of scale in managing a large fleet of taxis, Uber. Also, evidence suggests that once Uber or these platforms have run competing firms out of the market, they raise their prices. The corporate plan is never one of improvement. And this is a quote I got from a brilliant book I read today. It's never, the corporate plan is never one of improvement, but conquest. And I just, reading this, I just thought, these are hardly the type of businesses that governments should be encouraging. So why are governments, including the Scottish governments, kind of enthralled by this idea of platforms and startups and the desire for unicorns? These are terrible businesses to be chasing. Why, either of you got any thoughts on why these businesses just seem like they're held in such high regard, despite all the evidence they have huge damage, but their whole business case is on destruction rather than creating something different? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I can start briefly, and then for me there are a couple of things there. So I think on the one hand, we got a little bit trapped about the all the AI race and like trying to keep on anything that is related to this, so this can be more competitive, the space with no regulation and supporting all these kind of businesses. Particularly, we can see this in Edinburgh, but I think it's something that is happening. It's been a conversation around in the UK, so I think that could bring some kind of obfuscation about what really matters and what are the consequences and how these technologies are deployed, and this got ramifications on the gig economy. But then also there is extensive and right tradition was 10 years, well, not tradition, but of lobbying on this. And there are actually really good articles of this, on investigation on, you actually can find a good number of advisors from the Cameron era all the way to Starmer, who have been jumping between governments and big platforms, and particularly Uber and Deliveroo. So and they've been trying to make this work and in that sense, and they have put a lot of money and effort to allow them to do all this. I think that Callan have something interesting to say about this.
I mean, I think that the what's interesting about the government relation to these is it doesn't seem to be too concerned to bring them into the current systems of employment rules, employment law. And the big debate at European level is, I guess, whether to try and align them within employment law standards or whether to regard them as the new system of the organization and of work. And I think that, to step back from the good or bad for a moment, I guess there will be some who would say the 20th century structuring of work in certain number of hours in a day, producing quite often on site in an industrial setting that was then transposed into service sector and into other sectors, it all has a history. There's no set form of work. That we have a kind of universal, global, timeless norm and deviations from those norms. And so I think the debate is in some ways is helpfully seen as about whether people regard these technologies as generating and indicating a major shift into new forms of work and new ways of organizing work. And then we need to figure out how we deal with them, versus those who say that we need to align and kind of bring these different forms of work into the structures of the 20th century kind of movements. So I think that it's just pulling that argument apart about, I suppose, about the technological developments that capital is able to use to control labor can't necessarily be kind of put back in the box by at least any of the states that we have here. And so I think it then becomes a question, okay, are you trying to find ways to deal with that in terms of your political economy? None of that is to dispute that these are going to be pretty predatory. And in many ways, the one way to think of it is it's a predator in an environment where the prey and the people looking after the prey haven't figured out to prevent how to prevent the predators from running riot. There'll come a time, sure, bosses are predatory. That's not news to anyone. It's not something about the platforms. The platforms aren't the predators. It's still capital behind it. So if capital is predatory, we know that already. The question is, how do we figure out how to come to terms with the way they are using technologies to exercise that predatory power?
Yeah, great. And I think that a really important point is that quite often we consider that the role of government is to counter this kind of predatory nature. And actually, we must be aware that actually, because of the corporate capture and the kind of connection between our establishment, that actually this might be seen as a really good thing. We've really got to be conscious that we have to elect the right politicians who are going to fight for us, rather than just assume that because they're politicians, they're going to try and reduce these kind of negative impacts. I did want to finish. I've not got enough time to go into detail on the job guarantee. So I've got a specific question for you. I'm going to push both of you in the next couple of weeks about getting a support for the job guarantee from both of you. But if I was to say to you, imagine the government funded local communities to provide jobs that the communities decided that they wanted for a fair wage, a fair job, the amount of hours that you wanted to work. So, with that very, very constricted kind of assumption, what impact would that have on these types of jobs and this type of industry? I suppose I'm pushing it. If there really was a genuine alternative that was a decent living job that you could have the complete freedom to leave, would that have a positive or a negative impact on these types of jobs and the types of people and the type of conditions? Javi, do you want to go first on that? That'll be the last question, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more familiar with the universal basic income rather than the job guarantee. But I think that in any case, I think that anything that helps to create jobs with better quality will be good from the point of view of work, especially if you have to think that all of these workers, riders, and so on, they don't have any sick days, holidays, all these kind of things that are things that through struggle, were gained, and so any kind of policy that helps to create jobs on a higher quality, it will be great from the point of view of work, and probably will not make that happy the companies, because then they will not be able to profit from misery like they've been doing. So, and they are doing right now. So yeah, from that perspective, I think that will be good, of course.
I think it raises for me the question: is the population of that area then going to be fixed, or is there scope for more people to move into the economy in that area? And the reason I ask that is
it'd be a job guarantee across Scotland, for example.
Okay, so it would apply equally to migrants and non-migrants and people who have less secure visa status and those who have got very secure visa status. And so it would be, I suppose the reason I ask that is because it is worth bearing in mind that quite a lot of the people who work in the gig economy for quite obvious reasons, are those who don't have access to many of the ways in which the kind of better organized and better remunerated economy works for a lot of the population. People, quite often it's people who are migrants who are here for a while, who don't have the skills, who haven't been through the education system. So a whole range of different reasons mean, that those are the jobs that people can do. And I think that is it's an issue that absolutely we need to be always mindful of in the sense of developing labor market policies. But I suppose I'm just pointing to the fact that there's a big debate going on at the moment. I mean, it's fueled by the UK government about targeting food delivery workers and gig workers because they are migrant workers. And I think that if we talk about the job guarantee in a way that is fully inclusive of and makes clear that this is about providing work for absolutely everybody, whoever you are, then that sounds great. I'm just always a little bit nervous about work schemes and job schemes that might have blind spots, because those blind spots are quite often the places where the gig economy will come in and the conditions will be poor. But sure, if we can develop a system of jobs for absolutely everyone, then I think that probably would cause some trouble for these platforms.
Yes, which would certainly be part of the of the objective is, to try and weed out the terrible employers out of your system, and obviously having a position where anyone could leave a job knowing that they had a safe, secure job with dignity would put huge pressure. I would be surprised if any of these platforms could in any way be profitable if there was an alternative. And these platforms have only arisen because there is no decent alternative to this type of work. And as you said, a big part of that is migrant labor as well.
If I might just, my caveat in all this is that the good conditions of work historically haven't been a gift of the state. They tend to have been won by workers. And so I'm always kind of thinking in terms of how that power will be won by workers coming together and demanding it. I can see, however, that the policies can make a difference here. But I think that that's always about thinking where the power relations are too.
Absolutely. As always, we know that it's as much about power as it is about anything else. Guys, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And Kieran, as I said at the start, I knew you were all super busy today. I've had a wonderful hour finding out more about that. I know our audience have as well. So thank you very much, guys. I'll see you soon. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another show. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon. And I'm going to leave you with that little advert again. Bye for now. If you're enjoying this episode of the Scotonomics podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/Scotonomics. Also, please do like, share, and comment on this podcast.